Imagine standing in the freezing cold, your hands tied behind your back, staring directly at a firing squad. Soldiers raise their rifles. In a few seconds, you will be dead. Every heartbeat feels like the final one. Your entire life flashes before your eyes not as memories, but as questions you never answered. And then, suddenly at the very last moment, a messenger arrives. The execution is cancelled. You are spared. This moment, terrifying, surreal, and life-altering, was experienced by one of the greatest writers in human history, Fyodor Dostoevsky. But the real story is not just about surviving death. It is about what happens to a person after they stare directly into the abyss and what truths they discover about human nature. Dostoevsky would spend the rest of his life trying to answer one terrifying question. What if the greatest danger to humanity is not the world around us, but the chaos inside our own minds? Dostoevsky was born in 1821 in Moscow, into a relatively comfortable and religious family. His father was a respected doctor, and the young boy grew up surrounded by the suffering of patients in the hospital where his father worked. From an early age, he witnessed illness, poverty, and death. These were not abstract ideas to him. They were daily realities. When he was still a teenager, tragedy struck. His mother died from tuberculosis. Not long after, his father died under mysterious circumstances. Rumors spread that he had been murdered by his own servants because of his harsh treatment toward them. Whether the story was true or not, the psychological impact on the young Dostoevsky was profound. Suddenly, the world seemed darker and more unpredictable. Death could come at any moment. And ordinary people, were capable of terrible things. Despite these hardships, Dostoevsky pursued education and eventually studied engineering. Yet his heart was never truly in mathematics or machines. His real passion was literature. He spent nights reading philosophy, psychology, and fiction, fascinated by the strange contradictions within human beings. Eventually, he abandoned engineering completely and devoted himself to writing. His first novel was an immediate success. Critics praised it as one of the first major social novels in Russian literature. For a brief moment, it seemed that Dostoevsky's life would follow the traditional path of a successful author. But fate had other plans. In his late 20s, Dostoevsky became involved with a group of intellectuals who discussed political reform and philosophical ideas. At the time, the Russian government viewed such discussions as dangerous. Soon, he was arrested along with the rest of the group. After months in prison, the verdict was announced: death. Dostoevsky was sentenced to be executed by firing squad. On a cold December morning in 1849, he and several other prisoners were taken outside. They were dressed in white burial clothes. Coffins were placed nearby. This was not a threat. It was real. The soldiers prepared their rifles. Dostoevsky believed he had only minutes left to live. Then something unexpected happened. Just before the execution, a messenger arrived with an official order from the Tsar. The execution had been cancelled. It was a mock execution designed purely as psychological torture. Instead of death, Dostoevsky was sent to Siberia for years of brutal labor in prison camps. But those years would transform him completely. In Siberia, he lived among criminals, murderers, and thieves. He saw humanity at its lowest point, yet he also saw something surprising. Even the worst criminals still possessed moments of kindness, regret, and humanity. This experience deeply changed his understanding of morality. People were not simply good or evil. They were complicated, contradictory, capable of both darkness and redemption. When Dostoevsky finally returned from exile years later, he was no longer the same optimistic intellectual who had been arrested. He had seen too much suffering, too much chaos in the human soul. But instead of losing faith in humanity entirely, he began exploring these contradictions through literature. And this is when he wrote the works that would change the world. One of his most famous works, Notes from Underground, introduced one of the most unusual characters in literature, a bitter, isolated man who despises society and constantly contradicts himself. This character believes that humans are fundamentally irrational. He argues that even if people were given perfect happiness, they would still find ways to destroy it. Why? Because human beings don't just want comfort. They want freedom. Even the freedom to make terrible choices. Dostoevsky believed that people often sabotage their own happiness simply to prove that they are not controlled by logic or systems. In other words, humans would rather suffer freely than live perfectly inside a machine-like world. This idea shocked many readers. At the time, society was becoming increasingly confident in science, progress, and rational thinking. Many believed that technology and logic would eventually solve all human problems. But Dostoevsky was skeptical. He believed that human nature itself would always create new problems. The more society tried to eliminate suffering, the more complex new forms of suffering would appear. And perhaps his most famous exploration of this idea appears in his masterpiece Crime and Punishment. The story follows a young man named Rodion Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov is intelligent but desperately poor. He believes society is unfair and that extraordinary individuals have the right to break moral rules if it benefits humanity. Driven by this idea, he commits a terrible crime. He murders an old pawnbroker, believing that her death will allow him to use her money to do greater good for society. At first, the plan seems logical. But almost immediately, something unexpected happens. Guilt. Raskolnikov begins to collapse psychologically. His mind becomes filled with paranoia, fear, and self-hatred. Despite his intellectual justifications, his conscience refuses to stay silent. The real punishment is not prison. It is the unbearable weight of knowing what he has done. Through this story, Dostoevsky reveals something profound about human nature. We often believe we understand ourselves. But we don't. Our actions are not controlled purely by reason. There are deeper forces inside us, emotions, instincts, morality, that we cannot easily escape. Raskolnikov believed he was strong enough to live with his crime. But he misunderstood his own soul. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the novel is that readers often find themselves sympathizing with him. Dostoevsky forces us to see that even someone capable of terrible actions can still feel human. This realization leads to a disturbing question. If a murderer can still feel human, how different are we from him? Dostoevsky believed that every person contains both darkness and light. The difference between criminals and ordinary people is not always as large as we would like to believe. Under the right circumstances, desperation, pride, ideology, almost anyone could cross moral boundaries they once thought impossible. Yet despite the darkness in his stories, Dostoevsky never believed humanity was completely hopeless. In fact, many of his novels end with the possibility of redemption. Through suffering, confession, compassion, and faith, people can change. They can rebuild themselves. They can rediscover meaning. But the path is never easy. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths about who we really are. And perhaps that is why Dostoevsky's work still resonates today. In a modern world filled with technology, progress, and scientific knowledge, we often assume we understand ourselves better than previous generations. But Dostoevsky might disagree. He would likely argue that human nature has not changed at all. We are still irrational, still contradictory, still searching for meaning in a universe that rarely gives clear answers. And perhaps the most uncomfortable idea he left behind is this: human beings may not actually want perfect happiness. Because perfect happiness would remove struggle, conflict, and the freedom to choose, and without those things, what would it even mean to be human? Dostoevsky spent his life exploring these questions through his writing, leaving behind masterpieces like The Brothers Karamazov, which continues to influence philosophers, psychologists, and writers even today. But perhaps the most haunting lesson from his life came from that moment when he stood before the firing squad. When he believed he had only minutes left to live, he suddenly realized something most people never truly understand. Life itself, even with all its suffering, is unimaginably precious. Every second matters. Every moment is a gift. And yet, most of us move through life as if it will never end. We postpone our dreams. We ignore the beauty around us. We assume there will always be more time. But what if there isn't? What if the truth Dostoevsky discovered in that moment is something we only realize when it's too late? And if that is true, then the real question becomes something far more unsettling. If we truly understood how fragile life is, would we live differently? Or would we still continue pretending we have forever?